The Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa is facing heavy criticism for awarding a multi-billion-rand train maintenance tender to companies with no capacity. So the 7.5 billion rand tender is meant to bring back trains that were off the tracks for years. Joining us to unpack the story is Tebogo Tshwane from AmaBhungane Investigative journalist with the outfit. Tebogo, a very good afternoon to you. I think you're joining us by phone today. Grateful for your time nonetheless. You have published in the last day or so a longer piece on what's going on at Prasa, and you're saying that what's happened here threatens to a degree the very existence of the rail operator.
Thank you for having me, Talikile. And yes, so basically, you know, the article that we published yesterday, if I can maybe put it simply, is that if you're a transport company, you would need a group of people, or you would need people within the organization or outside of the organization who would be responsible for conducting maintenance on your vehicles. And if these contracts are terminated or come to an end for whatever reason, you should have a replacement or a stopgap measure in place while you work on a long-term solution to sort of fill that void. And in rail, one of these major sort of planned maintenance services that trains go through is called a general overhaul. And this is the contract that we wrote about yesterday. It's a 7.5 billion rand contract to conduct this form of major maintenance on process trains that refers to really the complete refurbishment or upgrading of the body of the train. You completely strip it down, you upgrade any obsolete technologies, fit it with maybe new components, or fix the ones that are there, and you really deal with the wear and tear so you can bring it back into a position where it's almost brand new and is less likely to break down. And a lot of process trains were due for this maintenance by the time that Prasa cancelled it. And there was nothing in place in order to fill that gap. But the problem then also was compounded by the fact that it took Prasa almost 3 years to award this tender. So a lot more of the coaches, either that have been wrecked or that were just generally due for the heavy maintenance, started to create a backlog in Prasa's system. And what we show in our article is that Prasa itself was very much aware of the fact that this backlog had been building, and it was considering, or at least the technical department had made a suggestion or a request to say, we need to appoint more contractors than what we had initially envisaged to appoint, because the fact that we didn't have an active contract by the time that the other one was terminated, and then this period of inactivity means that we have a lot of trains that are sitting in our depots that cannot go back into service because they need to undergo this maintenance. And if we're going to have new entrants in this contract, and because of the fact that our old contractors haven't been working for at least the past 3 years, we'll at least need more numbers to mitigate against any form of poor performance. And
so with that in mind, Tebogo, so there's a long list of what sounds to be a failure by the entity to respond to what was a changing situation that should have been better assessed in the beginning. How much money has actually changed hands?
At the moment, well, we know that contracts were signed with the service providers who appointed. Prasa appointed 5 service providers. It initially went into market to appoint 10, and then tried to revise the number of 10, but then even landed with 10 service providers. 5 service providers. And the contracts with these service providers were signed in June of this year. But it would be difficult to tell how much money has changed hands, because as we show in our article, is a lot of the service providers that were ultimately appointed by Prasa could not hit the ground running when they received their awards because of issues such as one of the service providers is a Russian rolling stock subsidiary of Transmash Holdings, TMH Africa. They went into business rescue 3 days after they received the award. And they've been trying to finalize that business rescue process and streamlining the business's operations so that it can actually now get out of business rescue and start work. But they still in business rescue, at least by the time that we wrote the article and we published, they were still in business rescue. So it's not clear if they started working or not. Another company had been evicted from the property that they initially applied for the tender with. And by the time that Prasa awarded them the contract in April, they were still evicted from that property and only managed to get occupation back into that property in September of this year. A third company had issues with their property due to the floods that affected KZN in April earlier on this year, and I think they only started working sometime last month. Mm-hmm. The company that was appointed in the Eastern Cape, which is the sole service provider in the area, I mean, there's no real update as to what position they're in, but what we were able to establish is by June at least they did not have a facility to do this work, and they had made an application to lease a workshop that belonged to one of the other bidders who had applied for this contract, but then shortly went into liquidation after they realized that it was not awarded to them. So that means that they could not have necessarily used that property to apply for the tender because another company who was competing against them had used that property to apply for the tender. But it also shows you that they would not have been in occupation
right.
of the area by the time that they were awarded the contract.
I'm glad you mentioned the companies because some of the companies that were in the bidding process have in fact now launched litigation against Prasa, correct?
Yes. We have two companies who have launched litigation against Prasa. The first movers were Naledi Rail Engineering. It is a company that is owned by businesswoman Plani Kingston, who bought it out of business rescue, I think in November of 2021. And the issue with Naledi is quite specific in that they were disqualified from the bidding process because Prasa had said that they would not be able to make a decision on whether or not they'd be awarded the contract or be rejected from the contract if they had not resolved a different dispute that had to do with a different contract prior historically. And the problem is that the issue with Naledi's case is that Prasa seems to have introduced an additional requirement to vet Naledi on than what the specifications of the tender were. And Naledi is saying that, this was unfair, and it is also something that when they had the interdict hearing and the judgment came out from that interdict hearing, which was not necessarily granted, but the judge said that Naledi had at least put enough of a case to say Prasa had treated it unfairly by saying we're going to keep you in limbo and while we deal with this other issue, because it really does come across as though you're dangling the contract, a carrot of this new contract in front of us in order to sort of leverage on us cancelling a separate dispute that we have against you.
Mm-hmm. Tebogo, just lastly, I'm drawn to a line in your piece which I was reading last night where you say this: Prasa did not offer any substantial response to our questions. What was the response when you went forward to them with what you'd been able to gather from the court documents, the emails?
So when we went to Prasa with questions, our questions were structured in two phases. We wanted to get an understanding as to what level of services are being provided by Prasa, what has been recovered, because we all know that Prasa's infrastructure was destroyed after the irregular security contracts were cancelled, and they are on a long-term program to repair and rebuild the operations of Prasa. So we really wanted to get a sense of how much of the services have really been impacted and out of service in that period, but then so that we can actually juxtaposition the importance of this contract to Prasa services. And then the second part of our questions really dealt with the stuff that we wanted answers on, or we wanted clarity on with regards to how they managed this contract. Take Transnet, for instance. Transnet was one of the bidders that made it at least past the evaluation and adjudication phase and recommended to the board for appointment. But when they get to the board appoints external auditors and lawyers to sort of relook the entire evaluation process to see if it's compliant, as well as to ensure that there won't be any litigation that they could be exposed to if they make awards. Mm-hmm. That is everything above board. One of the the auditors, in relooking the tender process, say that Transnet did not submit signed financial statements, and this is one of the mandatory requirements of the tender. Transnet has, of course, rejected this finding, and this is what we show in the piece. But our question was that there seems to have been a provision under those mandatory requirements that say if an award is made, a bidder can be given 7 days to submit some of these documents, and signed audited financial statements are one of them. When we assessed the submissions that were made by two other bidders, TMH Africa and YNF Engineering, who were ultimately awarded the contract, we find that they only submitted 1 year's financial statements as opposed to the 3 that Prasa required, but they were not disqualified. So we went to Prasa and asked, in this specific instance, to say, why is it that provision of the 7 days to submit these mandatory documents was not effected when it comes to Transnet, but also it appears as though you were inconsistent in applying sort of the scrutiny that you placed towards every bidder's submission, because we have these two companies who did not submit the 3 that you required, and yet they were ultimately awarded a portion of this contract. What's the rationale? What was the logic behind that decision? And we received absolutely no response.
Tebogo Tshwane, a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for your time today. Tebogo is an investigative journalist with the AmaBhungane team.